Breaking Up with Addiction is proudly supported by experts you can trust. Kindbridge Behavioral Health. Safe, non-judgmental counseling just a tap away. Visit kindbridge.com/appointments and start getting the help you deserve. Welcome to Breaking Up with Addiction. I'm Gwendolyn Boyd McGee, a licensed clinical professional counselor.
And I'm Coach Corinne Wright, certified executive coach and recovery coach. Last week, we gave you some homework. We asked you some questions, and we want to know if you were able to follow through. We asked you to think about the first time you were exposed to gambling, how that transitioned in your life, and what impact did it make? Just like that partner that you had a bad romance with and you didn't get to do that breakup in person, but you had an opportunity to write that breakup letter and it still felt good to get those things off your chest. Were you able to write your breakup letter to addiction? And if not, there's never a time better to do it than now. Welcome into today's episode on understanding gambling addiction.
So, what is gambling addiction? The American Psychiatric Association's definition states that it's identified by a pattern of repeated and ongoing betting and wagering that continues despite creating multiple problems in several areas of an individual's life. And one thing I do want to point out is that individuals in any age group may suffer from gambling addiction. Those who suffer from gambling disorders have trouble controlling gambling. And this leads to individuals, families, and society being affected by the gambling addiction. So last week, Corinne, we discussed the criteria for a gambling disorder that's located in the DSM-5. So I kind of wanted to talk about what this may actually look like in a person's life.
Yeah.
So people with gambling addiction can have periods where the symptoms subside and maybe they're not so severe. And there may be times that they feel like the gambling is really not a problem because they have those times that they don't. But that doesn't mean that the times that they do gamble, that there are not severe symptoms that are, there at those times. So some people say, well, I don't gamble that much. I only gamble, a couple of times a month. But what does that look like? How severe is that, the gambling addiction, the 2 times that you do go?
Right.
Yeah. So younger age and male gender are pretty risky factors for gambling addiction, but really the addiction can start at any age. Statistics show that men are more likely to start gambling at a younger age compared to women, but that women can progress to problem gambling much faster. So there are other factors like trauma and social inequality, actually, particularly for women, that may be risk factors. When they're experiencing the stress from that, it can cause them, like we talked about before, to kind of want to escape. And so that's why, gambling can look differently for women. But some other risk factors may include low income, unemployment, poverty, because then they're looking at the gambling to try to provide a source of extra funds for them. So there's been an increase in the number of people with gambling problems since there's more of an availability of gambling opportunities. And I feel like this can be attributed to the variety of online opportunities for gambling that we discussed last week, with the change after COVID, more relaxed regulations, whatnot, more opportunities to gamble. Yes. So gambling addiction, like we said before, it does not discriminate. It can impact anyone who gambles, regardless of economic, social, cultural, or levels of education. So anyone who gambles can develop a gambling problem. And there are certain factors that can increase your risk of developing an addiction. And those include genetics, environment, medical history, and age.
There's been a lot of questions that people ask us around, gambling addiction. I'm going to go through some of those with you, Gwen, because this is a lot of good information Do casinos, lotteries, and other types of gambling cause problem gambling is one of those questions.
Yeah, no, and the answer is absolutely not. I mean, casinos and the lottery provide opportunity for a person to gamble, but it doesn't cause problem gambling or gambling addiction any more than a person who goes to a liquor store. You know, the liquor stores are not creating the alcohol problems. They're just there, you know, providing an opportunity to purchase it. Yeah.
What type of gambling or types of gambling causes the most gambling problems or problem gambling?
Corinne, since the cause of a gambling problem is a person's inability to control their gambling, any type of gambling can become problematic. However, research has shown that there are types of gambling that do have certain characteristics that may make gambling problems worse, you know, like the fast, you know, action type of games. Yeah. While a lot of those factors are still poorly understood, anecdotal reports suggest that one risk factor may be, like I said, the fast speed of play. In other words, the faster a wager reaches an outcome, kind of like 21, you know, or blackjack, those go really fast, the more likely players may be to develop problems with a particular game.
So it's not about the game, it's about the player.
Absolutely. Yes.
How can a person be addicted to something that's not a substance?
Well, although no substance is ingested, Corinne, someone with a gambling problem kind of gets the same effect from gambling as a person may get from like taking a drug or drinking alcohol. You know, just like a person builds tolerance to drugs or alcohol, a person with unhealthy gambling habits finds that it takes more and more of the gambling experience, you know, to achieve the same emotional effect, to get that dopamine. So this creates an increased urge, you know, for the gambling activity, and it just makes it harder to resist. Really? Yeah.
And, you know, we've touched on this before. We'll touch on it again and again. But a lot of people are curious as to whether or not individuals with gambling problems usually have other things they're addicted to as well.
Well, generally, people with one addiction are really at more risk to develop another. But some individuals who are impacted by problem gambling, you know, they may already be dealing with something co-occurring like alcohol or drugs. But it doesn't mean that just because you have a gambling addiction that you have to have another addiction. Some people with gambling problems actually never experience any other addiction because no other substance or activities really give them the same kind of feeling that the gambling does.
Yeah.
But there's also evidence of family patterns around dependency, as many people experiencing problem with gambling report that one or both of their parents had a drinking and or a gambling problem. Corinne, I'd also like to share some of the cognitive and psychological impacts of gambling addiction. So we've already have been discussing how, you know, gambling addiction can lead to significant cognitive and psychological problems. But I'd like to kind of get into more detail. So there are some cognitive effects that can happen, you know, with the disordered gambling. One of them is impaired decision making. So, you know, gambling, you know, and all of the effects that come with that can cause and make it very difficult to make good decisions, not only when it comes to the gambling, but also in other areas of a person's life. They can become very impulsive, and the impulsivity causes them, you know, it makes it difficult for them to resist the urge to gamble, even when they are facing financial and personal consequences. I mean, I've heard of people, unfortunately, you know, they're in jeopardy of losing their home, you know, or their apartment, getting evicted, and they're still going back and still gambling. So, you know, despite the consequences, you know, they still have that urge to gamble, and they just have not been able to get that under control.
Which honestly, Gwen, when you think about that, just hearing you say that, that's usually the behavior people would pair with someone who's doing drugs or alcohol, because it's similar. It's like, you know, no matter the impact or the consequence, they still keep going back. And that's how we know this is a disorder.
Absolutely, Corinne. Yeah. And some of the distortions, I'd like to kind of, you know, let our listeners give them the education and help them to understand, what cognitive distortions are and how they can be involved, in a gambling addiction. Mm-hmm. So there's the illusion of control. This is when the gambler falsely believes that they can control the outcome of the games of chance, leading to continued gambling despite the losses, despite the consequences. They just continue. Another distortion is gambler's fallacy. I think this one's widely known and talked about quite often. But with the gambler's fallacy, the individual believes that a win is more likely after a series of losses, just completely ignoring the fact that it's, there's independence of each gamble. Mm-hmm. Every time you gamble, it's always 50-50, win or lose. So just because you have lost 50 times doesn't mean that by 51 you're going to have a win.
Absolutely.
So that's why, so that's why it's called fallacy, gambler's fallacy. Another one, the near miss effect. I always like to use the hypothetical of a person sitting at a slot machine, and then they get 2 cherries and a lemon. But those 2 cherries is telling them, oh, a win is right around the corner. You're going to get that other cherry.
If that lemon is like halfway, Gwen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I almost had it. Yeah. So the near miss effects, that's a way that people are drawn back into gambling. So selective memory is one. And I know that selective memory can be used for a lot of different things, but in reference to gambling, it's like, always tend to remember more of the times that you win as opposed to the times that you lose. And that's just, to me, that's like the brain is just letting you remember those wins because it wants to get some more of that dopamine, right?
Absolutely. Dopamine is something that a lot of people don't even know how it works or what it is. All they know is that they get shots of it. Where is it coming from? And for some people that do gamble, the assumption is that that's the only place to get the dopamine if that's the first place they had such a rush of the dopamine hit.
Right. And I'd like to mention just one last cognitive distortion. That is the magical thinking. This is when the individual may develop certain superstitions or beliefs about something like, if I stand up, turn around 3 times, sit down, then that's my magic formula. Yeah. Or, if I wear my lucky green socks that I've never washed because they have all the luck on them, then I'm going to win. So those are just examples of how the magical thinking works. There's also psychological effects. The one I'd like to mention first is the emotional instability. So a person with gambling addiction can also experience significant emotional distress. So it may show up in a person's life through anxiety, through maybe depression or something like that. And like we said, people who have gambling addiction are at higher risk for co-occurring. So there's also the increased risk of suicide. The psychological toll of gambling addiction can lead to a person having suicidal thoughts. Let's put this in context. I mean, a person, is already in debt, hiding the gambling from their friends and family. Mm-hmm. So, that's a huge struggle. And then they're like, I'm at the point, I feel like I can win. I could get this money back, get my life together. They spend all this time at the casino, right? And lose more money. Yeah. You could see how a person could start feeling desperate, and that could lead to potentially them having some suicidal ideations.
Sometimes with that, people, if you're someone that isn't sure about what's going on with the person in your life that may be gambling, if you see them begin to isolate more, that is a red flag, especially if they're already depressed. If you're dealing with a depressed person gambling and then they start isolating more, red flag. And I just want to point out that we're not asking you to go around asking people if they're thinking about suicide, but if you were to ask a person that question, that does not plant the seed of now they're going to consider suicide because you asked them. A person who's thinking about that is already dealing with a litany of things that arrive them at those thoughts.
Right. And I noticed that you mentioned isolation. And so that was the first, the next thing that I wanted to point out. So that's another effect, psychological effect. The isolation, social isolation. When gambling becomes your primary focus, you forget about everything else. You forget about, going out to the happy hours, maybe with your friends, or going out to play pickleball or tennis, some of the hobbies or interests that you used to enjoy, playing golf, going out, jogging, taking your children to the park. Once a person does have a gambling addiction, they usually end up isolating and not really be engaged and connected with their family and their friends. So guilt and shame. They may experience intense feelings of guilt and shame because of the gambling addiction. Same scenario. Think about this person who's been doing all of this covering up, and this person's also in debt and they're desperate. You can imagine the kind of guilt and shame they're carrying around. The last psychological effect that I'd like to point out is the substance abuse. And we've talked a lot about this. Sometimes people are actually trying to use alcohol maybe as a unhealthy coping strategy, and could potentially, just start depending on it too much. And that can happen with alcohol or drugs. So it's time for trivia, Corinne.
Let's go.
So today's trivia question is, how many people with a gambling disorder will actually seek treatment?
That's a really good question. I'm curious.
Yeah, the answer is going to be not only shocking, but a little disappointing. But we'll talk about that later at the end of the show.
Well, now we're going to roll into a little bit of talk about problem gambling and the mental health aspects of it. Gwen did a great job of covering some of the psychological aspects, which do bleed into the sharing of some of the mental health pieces of it. But one of the things that I want you to think about is when we say the term mental health, what we're talking about is the state of your mindset, your headspace. This is where you live every day of your life, from the moment that you wake up. Every thought that you have, the things you think about, the things you see, the things you touch, taste, smell, do, all of that plays a role into how you see the world, how you experience the world, and everything else that comes from that. So when you add a gambling addiction to whatever already existed there, now we're not having so much fun. Why coaching and therapy for gambling addiction? Coaching and therapy complement each other in gambling addiction recovery. Coaching provides practical guidance, accountability, and empowerment, helping individuals to set goals and stay motivated. Whereas therapy addresses the emotional and psychological roots of addiction, offering healing and tools and ways to manage the underlying issues of the gambling. For lots of people that we work with, they will tell you after many sessions that they can trace back these things to their childhood without us probing for that, but I've had people to tell me the first time I was exposed to gambling was back when I was probably 7 or 8. And when you think about the history of gambling that we gave them in week 1, Gwen, and how it started with things like heads and tails, and it just kind of progressed from there. There's so many people who've been exposed to it, but that does not make everyone a problem gambler. It's if it's developing those problems in your life. So just to jump down into some real information here on a study that the University of Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling did in 2021. It highlighted some interesting facts that I definitely wanted to unpack here for a moment with you, Gwen, today. And one of these statistics, it's, nearly 1/3 to half of individuals in substance use disorder treatment were identified as having problem gambling.
Wow, that's a very large number.
And this goes back to when you were discussing those co-occurrences. This is a live example of how that plays out in the world. It's, nearly 1/3 of the people in substance use disorder treatment were identified as problem gamblers. Keyword in that statement is identified. So imagine the people who may have that guilt or shame when asked that question, or maybe that question didn't come up. So we really don't know if that 1/3, how accurate that 1/3 is, but we know that at least a third.
Yeah, that's quite shocking.
Yeah. And the more severe you have SUDS, which is substance use disorder, the higher the prevalence of gambling problems. So, of the 1/3 who are impacted by it, the more severe your use of substances, the more severe, the more prevalent and severe your gambling problems are going to be.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then individuals with a lifetime history of mental health disorders had 2 to 3 times the rate of problem gambling. So if I'm dealing with things like bipolar, depression, and so on, I'm 2 to 3 more times to be a problem gambler.
Wow. Yeah. Well, but it does make sense.
I mean, it does. It's sad that it does, but it really does. And then we're going back to one of our favorite references, which is that DSM-5. And for those who don't know what DSM-5 is, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the book where all the mental disorders live. And they're talking about gambling in that book. So that's how, big this really is. Those with gambling disorders have high rates of substance use disorder, depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, and personality disorder.
Wow.
So gambling carries a lot of things with it. It doesn't come alone. It is intentional about what it will do in your life. And all you have to do is look next to you, have a conversation with the 5 people in the room with you. I promise you, there are gamblers present. But most times, the gamblers who gamble occasionally do not really consider themselves problem gamblers, which goes back to what Gwen said earlier. The frequency of your gambling is not what determines the problem gambling. It's what are you doing when you're gambling? I only gamble once a year, but I lose $2 million a year, right? So the frequency
that sounds pretty severe to me.
Exactly. And people are out there spending their annual income on gambling. Maybe not all at once all the time, but some do spend it at once. In 6 minutes, it's gone. And then that's why depression comes in so fast, because you can't believe what just happened. Building your awareness is the first step in addressing your mental health. The more you work on building your awareness, the more you will know what's going on, and that gives you access to direction. That's usually what leads people to us for support. I always ask, 3 questions. When did you start gambling? How has it impacted your life? And what brought you here? And the story, Gwen, it's the same story, just different details.
Yeah. The stories are very similar, just different details. You make a very good point, Corinne.
Yeah. It's like a cookie cutter framework, and then you come and fill it in. But when people build their awareness, what they're doing is they're noticing. A lot of gamblers who journal are, some of the most successful at navigating their why. When they're trying to figure out why am I doing this? And when you journal, answer the questions that come up, when you're really tracing back, when you're having coaching sessions with either, or therapy sessions, that's where you get to address these things. And, the more awareness you have on any topic in your life, the better equipped you are to address whatever the thing is. There are lots of things that are associated with gambling. When people hear the term gambler or gambling, it's almost like there's this snapshot world that comes to people's minds. But even people who don't gamble are also responsible for raising their awareness. And that's because if you have a problem gambler in your life, there will be impact.
Yes.
And have you seen or heard some stories, Gwen, in regards to impact from people that are not like married? Because we already know how we've seen the stories of how it impacts at home with spouses and things like that. But I'm curious from your perspective on impact as it comes with people in their interpersonal circles.
Well, I mean, of course, the thing that comes to mind first is that your relationships are going to suffer, because if you're not spending the time with whoever it is, if it's your girlfriend, boyfriend, just a friend, or a relative that you're used to hanging out with, I mean, once you get involved with gambling, you kind of like forget about them.
Yeah.
So, that is a really big loss, because then relationships are lost. I've seen, relationships with a parent, who an adult child is really upset because they see what it's doing, to their parent.
Yeah.
So yes, the relationships are definitely affected. I think that is the biggest loss that a person, can experience, with
And
gambling.
I agree with that. I definitely agree. I think that's what we probably see the most in driving people to recovery is the relationships, the impact on the relationships around them. And, there are questions that are sometimes asked, some people who are related to gamblers ask them questions like, why can't you just stop? And we hear that all the time. Mm-hmm. It's not something that the gambler can always answer because it's not about money. And we'll get into that a whole other day, but to understand what it is about versus money, because sometimes people are very well off financially and they still gamble. It's not just that they're trying to make more money. Sometimes people don't have much money and they'll still gamble the little they have. And it's not necessarily tied just to the money.
Right. It could be escape,
Which most times it is. It's to escape from something that's happening in their lives. So this is why we want to encourage those who don't have gambling problems to be supportive of, assisting those in your life that are impacted with getting the right help. And for those who are impacted directly, we want you to pursue that help for yourself as well. This is, something that is not going to go away by itself.
Right. It takes work. It takes action.
Getting to the root cause is important. It takes work, action, time, effort, understanding, and so much more.
Right.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about the stages of gambling, just so you can see, how this is like a snake around through the impact, where it starts and where you can land. And where do we usually start, Gwen?
We're starting at the good stage, the winning stage.
Yay!
Yeah, winning. Mm-hmm. This is the fun stage, right? So the individual experiences frequent wins, which reinforces the behavior and creates excitement. This stage, the winning stage, often feels like control is maintained and gambling just seems like a harmless activity.
Opposed to the losing stage. And we know what that is. That's, you've gambled, you've done the scratch offs, you've sat at the machines, you've been on the apps, and, the losses start to accumulate. You're like, well, it was just 2. Now it's 7. And this is chasing losses when you keep counting the losses, but you're still pursuing more attempts to gamble to make up for those losses.
Absolutely. And then, when you start losing, then you start getting desperate. Mm-hmm. So then we're going to move over into the desperation stage. And this is when the gambler really starts to get emotionally involved.
Yeah.
And so they may also be experiencing quite a bit of stress because they're trying to cover up, their losses. They don't want anybody to find out about it, especially, if they're married and their wife doesn't know about, the checking account or whatever.
Right.
They're just feeling really desperate, probably calling relatives, trying to borrow money or looking for payday loans or, applying for new credit cards that nobody knows about. Mm-hmm. Those kind of things.
And then there's that hopeless stage. And at this point, this is where you may feel completely out of control. You are experiencing significant financial, relational, and personal consequences as a result of the desperation stage. Because when you're desperate, you do desperate things. Mm-hmm. And then you lose hope as you're seeing the desperation doesn't fulfill itself with anything that can give you that relief. It's just a matter of that's where you are. You're desperate, and then it drives you into that hopelessness. Gambling becomes a compulsive behavior, and you may experience depression, guilt, and isolation. That's when you can expect this to be happening. And the reason why the compulsive behavior comes here is because you've passed desperation. Now you gotta do something, right?
Yeah, and I'd like to point out a lot of people, this is where in this hopelessness stage that they could potentially have some suicidal ideations.
Absolutely.
So for the listeners and for, the listeners' friends and family, I mean, if you know someone who looks like maybe they are experiencing, some suicidal ideations, you want to make sure that you're there to support them and give them referrals or take them to get the help they need.
Absolutely.
And the last one is rock bottom. Wow. This is a tough one, Corinne.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is when the gambler is like in crisis. And so you start losing everything financially, losing relationships, families like blocking your number. Don't call us. We don't want to help you, and you may even be facing some legal consequences.
Yeah, depending on what you've done in that, hopeless and desperation stage.
Yeah. So also in this stage, it can lead to seeking help or intervention, which is what we want. Sometimes that intervention can be voluntary. The gambler is like, I'm just tired. I can't do this anymore. I need some help. And they go get help. Or it could be, like a significant family member that is like, hey, either you're going to get help or I don't want to be in your life anymore. So sometimes it's other people really strongly encouraging them, to get treatment. The stage may not always be exactly in the order that we discussed, but it's likely that most people will go through all the stages.
Absolutely. And I like that you did point that out, Gwen, because sometimes, depending on the amount you're spending, your situation and who you are, that first time can land you in rock bottom. You can go directly from the first stage to rock bottom because, no one gets to judge what the status of winning, losing, or harm is in a person's life. What some gamblers may consider harmless, some gamblers may see that as this is the most harmful thing in my life. So, yeah, those stages are very important to point out in your life if you're the gambler and in other lives around you.
Right. So, Corinne, now that we've covered the stages of gambling, we don't want our listeners to feel that they are alone in this struggle. We want to let them know that help is available. So there are different approaches that may work better for different people. There's several types of therapy, several types of coaching that are utilized, to treat disordered gambling. Mm-hmm. So some of them could be like CBT. I tend to lean toward that one. I really like the cognitive behavioral therapy because I believe that if you change the way that you think, you can change your life. There's a psychodynamic therapy, group therapy, and family therapy. So through counseling and coaching, people can kind of, understand, they can learn more about the addiction, how it's affecting them, how it's affecting their family. And it can also help them to kind of, look at their situation and decide what options, they want to utilize and what solutions may work better for them. Even though there are no FDA approved medications to treat gambling disorder, there are some medications that are prescribed like for depression and anxiety that can be helpful to the gambler. I mean, especially if they're having those symptoms. But I've been told that medication like Lexapro, even though it's prescribed to treat depression and anxiety, that there's a component to it that can also be helpful for people who have like OCD or compulsive behavior, which is gambling. So that may be helpful. And there's also a medication called naltrexone that can be helpful for urges and triggers to help people to avoid a relapse. So as we have been saying throughout this podcast, support from friends and family, it's really critical to a person's recovery because it's difficult to really recover without some kind of support. But another resource that I think is very valuable, and I know that we have worked with, clients on getting them referrals to GA, Gamblers Anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the 12-step programs can be very helpful. It's just, peer support. You go to the meeting, you work the 12 steps. They encourage abstinence, complete abstinence, and they encourage you to get a sponsor and work with that person, through your journey of recovery so that you can have that accountability and that support. So I just want to make sure that our listeners are aware of Gamblers Anonymous because it is also a really good resource.
Okay. That, I don't disagree with that. I think that if you have never heard of Gamblers Anonymous, it's something to get familiar with. And if you have heard of it, it would not hurt to attend a meeting. You can attend a meeting virtually or in person. Mm-hmm. But let's get to that trivia answer, Gwen, because I'm really curious about that percentage you gave.
So the answer to today's trivia of how many people with a gambling disorder will actually seek treatment, only 1 in 10 people with a gambling disorder actually seek treatment.
That number's not surprising. It's not surprising. And you know what? You are going to be so excited for the next episode because we are going to break these numbers down so phenomenally to you that you won't be able to unsee gambling addiction. That is a disappointing number. You said it would be disappointing, Gwen, and it is. It's not surprising to me because we work in this field, but it is disappointing still. But we want to talk a little bit too on the impact of gambling addiction and just looking at sides of it from finances and the financial consequences. Like we said, there are people who have lost their, resources. And I know to most people who think this does not have anything to do with them, it doesn't impact them. If you really think about the people in your life that you are judging or annoyed with who do spend their dollars on gambling, before judging them, take one step back and listen to this podcast. Listen to these words we're sharing with you and really take a deep breath before reacting to the gambler based on whatever has happened. No one is saying to give them a break and just let it slide. What we're saying is try to come from an understanding perspective because even though they've done these things are not necessarily 100% in their control. These are things that are out of their control to a degree that they're impacting their lives in a way that's ridiculous to you. You're looking at it happen. So you have to know this is not a choice. So we talked about relationship strain too, but I want to bring that into the consequence of finances because money, when you think about marriage, Gwen, you said earlier how we both know how this goes in marriage. But if in a marriage, a lot of people believe that money is one of the biggest reasons for divorce.
Right.
Think about how you might have a partner who you wish you two could win together, but there is a disorder in between you.
Mm-hmm. It's tough to make. Relationships are already very challenging, but you put in some other factors like, gambling addiction, and it does complicate things and it makes it even more challenging, for the relationship because a lot of the people with disordered gambling end up trying to cover their gambling and, so there's lies, deception, and those kind of things. So it really does. It breaks down the trust in a relationship. And it's difficult for a person to, want to work on mending a relationship when they don't trust someone.
And especially if that person is still gambling, because we've had, clients that will remedy the trust, but then relapse. Mm-hmm. And it breaks it all over again. It shatters it even more and deepens all of the issues.
Right. And I would like to point out for our listeners, though, that, even though, we encourage our clients to utilize coping skills and strategies and other things to be able to identify triggers, and cope with urges, those kind of things. But it does happen that a person may experience a relapse. So relapse can be, it's not what we're going for, but relapse can be part of recovery because you think about it, it's an opportunity to learn what not to do.
Absolutely.
And it can kind of give you a wake up and let you realize that maybe you're not doing enough work or that you need additional treatment. Those kind of things.
Yeah, that relapse is sometimes like it's bad because of the damage that it does, but the silver lining in that relapse is being able to hunker down. It's now you're no longer assuming that you have this under control. Now you are accepting that you do not have this under control, but that might not have happened unless the relapse took place. We're not encouraging a gambler to have a relapse. We're encouraging abstinence, but we are
not at all.
Yeah, but we are making you aware that relapse can be a part of your recovery journey. And if it is, that's not something to necessarily beat yourself up about. It's something to build your awareness on and get to creating a more intense, and when I say intense, I mean fleshed out, outlined, detailed relapse prevention plan, because the purpose of that plan is to have something in place between you and returning to the gambling behavior.
Right.
And, that takes us into one of the things I wanted to point out in regards to thinking traps. Thinking traps are real. You can Google them. There are 3 that are usually very present with most gamblers that I wanted to point out. Now, all of us fall into any of the 10 to 12 thinking traps that there are at any given time. But when it comes down to a person who gambles and has gambling behavior, thinking traps like my thoughts are facts. And that could be tied to I need to gamble to get more money. Because you thought it, it's a fact and it must happen, right? That's a thinking trap. Another is emotional reasoning. If you're feeling a certain way and you're needing to escape, you're tired of getting into it with this person, you just need to get away and unplug, right? Emotional reasoning could be one of the thinking traps that makes you feel like you must do this action so that you feel this way or feel better or feel nothing, whatever it gives you when you're gambling. And then there's the fortune telling. And that's similar to the chasing losses. You know, that's similar to, oh, I'll make it back, or next time I'll win. You know, you don't know what's going to happen except that there is a high potential you will lose.
Right.
Reprogram the way you think by joining that conversation in your head when those thoughts come. If it's a question, answer it. If it's a spiraling thought, sit with that thought. Write that down. Do you need to journal about that to move on? But just letting it ruminate, that rumination is what drives you to the casino, is what drives your fingers to the apps. It's something that can be redirected, but it will take effort.
Right. And the effort is definitely worth it. Absolutely.
Just before we move on, I'm gonna breeze through some of this, and Gwen, you chime in here, but work and academia. If you're, how this impacts people at their job or at school, it can be very distracting. I know people who are on the app all day. Yeah, the app is if you're someone that does sports betting specifically too, and you have access to the apps on your phone and you work a job where you have downtime.
Or not,
or maybe you're just distracted, right?
Because I have had clients, tell me that, some of them work remotely, so they can gamble anytime. They can go on their phone anytime and do it. And they can do that during the day. Some of them may be in their cubicle, right there. Their phone is right there. So yeah, having that access, can make it really difficult for people.
Very difficult. And again, we encourage abstinence. So if you were to pursue help, there are things that we can help you put in place to prevent you from being able to get on those apps. We want to touch really quickly on some legal problems that can come out of gambling. And with that, we're not going to go into legal problems is in depth, but there are things like, criminal behavior, fraud, theft. Those are real things that happen. They happen in the workplace. They happen in, homes. They happen everywhere. Legal versus illegal gambling. I will go over a few legal, and Gwen's going to shout out some illegal gambling just so you'll know what you're doing, because some people don't know what they're doing. Some people don't know what's gambling. And that's why we're educating you on what is and isn't gambling, as well as where you stand in there. Some legal forms of gambling would be things like the casinos, account betting online, off-track wagering, the lottery, bingo, and internet gambling.
Now, the thing that comes to my mind for illegal gambling is, people do have, poker games, card games, all kinds of gambling stuff at their homes.
Yeah.
After hours, kind of with the speakeasy vibe or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, that's illegal.
Cockfights, dog fights, football pools. These are things that we want you to avoid.
Yes.
Physical health is the last thing we want to touch on, with stress-related issues like high blood pressure, sleep problems, and other health concerns. Please do not minimize sleep problems. That is something that could be a very intricate red flag to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Sleep is essential. That's something that I work with clients on quite often. Good sleep hygiene, sleep schedule, because insomnia can lead to all kinds of other issues like depression when we're not even, genetically predisposed. So getting a good night's sleep is essential. It's very important.
And we want to thank you for taking the time to listen in. And we want to encourage you to keep going and keep doing the things that you need to do to break free from addiction. Breaking free from the cycle of gambling begins with recognizing that your mind is powerful, but it's not always right. The thoughts that trap you are just that, thoughts. You have the strength to challenge them step by step to create a new path forward And every moment is an opportunity to rewrite the story and rebuild trust that you may have lost, not just with others, but also with yourself. Stay tuned for our next episode where we will dive deep into unpacking the numbers because numbers don't lie.
That's right. They sure don't. So, Corinne, it's time for the homework.
Let's go.
So, listeners, this week's homework involves learning how to identify your triggers. So, gambling doesn't just happen out of the blue. There are many situations that can trigger you, and recognizing the situations that make you more likely to gamble is really a very important step in the journey to changing your gambling behavior. So, by identifying triggers, you can develop effective strategies to address the underlying factors that are causing you to gamble. So to assist you with this homework assignment, I'd like to just provide you with some examples of possible triggers. So having difficulties with other people, like problem relationships, definitely can be a trigger. That's why I'm mentioning it first. Worrying about debts. Having unpleasant feelings like anger, frustration, sadness. Maybe it's peer pressure to gamble. I've heard a little bit of that going on with sports betting, and guys and their friends feeling pressure to gamble even when they feel like they should stop. Being in situations that involve winning, you get excited, you remember, how that dopamine felt, and that could trigger you to want to gamble again. A feeling for a need for excitement, like boredom. I've heard that from a lot of clients, Corinne.
That's a big one.
Boredom is a huge trigger. And of course, using alcohol or drugs.
Yeah.
We've talked about that before. That can certainly be a trigger.
Especially for someone who goes to casinos because they give you free drinks. And if you're already trying to manage your alcoholism and then you're in the casino, that's just a recipe for disaster.
It sure is. If you are considering or contemplating suicide or feel that you may be a danger to yourself or others, help is available. To get connected, dial 988 from your landline or cell phone. It is available in English and Spanish 24 hours a day. Again, to get connected, dial 988 from your landline or cell phone 24 hours a day.
Addiction doesn't define you, and breaking up with it doesn't have to be a solo mission. Kindbridge Behavioral Health offers safe, non-judgmental support anytime from anywhere. Visit kindbridge.com/appointments and start getting the help you deserve today.